Tonight's program, Autonomous Revolution, where artificial intelligence is driving unprecedented change in the world as we know it, in a technological revolution as decisive as the agriculture and industrial revolution. At CHM, we've evolved our mission to focus on decoding what it means to be human in a world of computing. In this topic, in the time that I've had to spend with Bill and Mike as they were preparing the book and actually reviewing things early, I really loved it. This is a world-class topic to reinforce what the purpose of this institution is really focused on, and that is to help bring some relevant context to what's going on in the world today, in the digital world. So this lens that we're thinking about is really, what does it mean to be human in a world of computing? Because it surrounds everything that we do all of the time. So in order to do this, we're focusing on bringing together audiences of all different kinds, shapes, and forms. We appreciate your support. As you know, the programs are free. We encourage you to consider membership. If you haven't seen our website in the last little while, I'm guessing you have because you signed up. But take a look, and if you could be so kind, consider joining the museum as a member. We'd appreciate your support. So introducing the speakers tonight will be Marguerite Gong Hancock. She's the founding executive director of the Exponential Center, which unto its title and name is indicative of the kinds of things that we'll hear on stage tonight from Bill and Mike and David. So Marguerite.
Thanks so much, Donald. Good evening. It's my pleasure to add my welcome to each of you. And now for tonight's program, water and ice. When water turns to ice, changing from liquid to solid, it undergoes a phase change. It obeys different rules, we use different tools, and our intuitions that we think about water tell us nothing about ice. And in their latest book, The Autonomous Revolution, Reclaiming the Future, we sold to machines, Bill Davidow and Mike Malone proposed that we're at the dawn of the third phase change in the history of civilization. And with this autonomous revolution, this era is driven by the forces of the virtual world, as well as intelligent and autonomous machines. Our institutions will assume new forms of play by new rules and using different tools. For ourselves, our sense of time and space, and perhaps even ourselves, might be irrevocably changed. What might be the implications for the economy, for the future of work, for free speech, privacy, and even value systems? What are the dangers if we treat these technological challenges simply as business as usual? Or if we understand the underlying drivers and their implications, can we find a way to surmount the challenges and shape a better future for humanity? Here to explore these important questions for our time and more are the book authors, Bill Davidow and Mike Malone, as well as Pulitzer Prize historian David Kennedy. As is our museum tradition, I'll introduce our speakers by using 5 numbers. William Davidow, author, venture investor, and former high-tech executive. 10/4/1957, the day Sputnik was launched and he decided to commit himself to technology to save the USA. 1979, the year he launched Crush campaign at Intel, the success which established him as one of Silicon Valley's marketing icons. 1980, the year that Andy Grove told him he was an average general manager, but the best marketing person in the company, a discussion that changed his career and his life. 5, the number of times he's written his last book. And 54, the number of years he's married to his wonderful wife, Sonia, who's here tonight. Bill Davidow. Next, Mike Malone, journalist. 1852, the year his home was built, the oldest in Silicon Valley. 93, the number of Eagle Scouts he's mentored. 24, the number of books he's published or co-authored. 320, the acres of Oklahoma land rush farm. And 95, the number of stitches in his knees. Mike Malone. To convene this conversation, who would be better than David Kennedy, the Donald McLaughlin Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University. 10/4/1957, that same day, the day Sputnik was launched and put him on the path to study electrical engineering at Stanford. 1961, the year his study in Italy actually convinced him that history was more interesting than engineering. Infinity, the number of books he's thought about writing. 3.5, the number of books he's written. That half, by the way, is the one that he co-authored. And last but not least, 8.16466, the weight in kilograms, or for those of you who are challenged, it's about almost 18 pounds. The largest fish he's ever landed on a dry fly. Please join me in giving a very warm CHM welcome to each of our speakers tonight. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you, David.
Thanks. Thank you, Marguerite.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marguerite, and thanks to all of you for being here. It was my great honor and pleasure to be in print between the same two covers with these two distinguished authors as the author of the foreword of the book, and it's a particular pleasure to be here on the stage with them this evening to talk about this book and its many, many provocative arguments. And to get us started, I'm going to ask Bill Davidow if he will give us a little foundation laying and framework for understanding the discussion to follow.
Well, first, I've always got to mention that coming back to the Computer History Museum is so nostalgic. I go downstairs and I see the picture of John McCarthy, the father of AI, who also taught me mathematics in 1956 at Dartmouth. And I always think of him using AI to solve an extremely complex problem at that time. The snow was falling and he walked out to a Chevrolet convertible and realized that he had a flat tire, and he used AI to fix it. He kicked it 3 times. Marguerite has given you the background of the book. It's about phase change, and she's pointed out that for the 3rd time in human history, society has undergone phase change, and we are now experiencing the autonomous revolution. And she used the analogy of water turning to ice, and she failed to mention one thing. We know that there's another thing that goes along with this. When water freezes, it breaks ice, and it sometimes sinks ships. Remember the Titanic. If we don't deal with phase change effectively, we're going to have problems. Now, phase change, in the social system, when our institutions undergo phase change, they change form, they obey different rules, and they use different tools. And once again, our intuition fails us. But they aren't driven by endo and exothermic reactions like phase change in the physical world. They're driven by equivalences. And in the case of the agricultural revolution, they were driven by a food equivalence. We substituted domesticated food for wild food. In the case of the Industrial Revolution, we substituted mechanical power for muscle power. And the important thing about the autonomous revolution is that it is being driven by 3 equivalences. The first of these is an intelligence equivalence. We're substituting machine intelligence for human intelligence. And that has all kinds of consequences. One of them is that it's going to lead to an end of work for many people. The second equivalence is a spatial equivalence. We're substituting virtual space for physical space. You shop in virtual space, you socialize in virtual space. But there's something we don't talk about very much about this. Our minds, our brains, our bodies, our senses, our brain chemistry, they were all adapted for survival in the physical environment. We are maladapted for the virtual environment. And there's something also very important about physical environments. The physical environment had no purpose. A tree did not grow to be firewood. When we go into virtual space, we are going into a space that has a very definite purpose. The controllers of virtual space are using it to control and program our behavior. And that is creating a number of really important challenges for us today. And we ought to understand that. And the third equivalence is something I call an information equivalence. Many of our institutions are just information proxies in disguise. A bank is an information processing system. Think about a building. You go to a building and it's got a parking lot, and there are cars, and then you enter the building and there's an elevator, and there are offices and desks, and people sit at those desks, and there is an information network. People send around pieces of paper, and they talk to one another, and then they exchange electronic messages. And there's a data storage network, pieces of paper, once again, in file cabinets, our memories, and also data storage in computer memory. And then there are voice recognition systems. We use people for that. And voice response systems. We use people for that. The information equivalent of that institution is 3 racks of electronics with flashing lights, and it displaces a call center. These are the kinds of transformations that are taking place as businesses suddenly become applications on our phone, and as we have virtual governments and potentially virtual currencies. Now, there are a lot of issues that arise because of this phase change. And one of the things that we're going to be discussing tonight is that this is not the 4th industrial revolution. This is something very different, because during the industrial revolutions, the forms of institutions did not change. When we replaced steam power with electric power, the factory was still a factory. It ran more efficiently. When we used computer power to replace the spreadsheet, we just ran the accounting department more effectively, but the business had the same form. And so we're going to something that is very different in the future. And what we're going to be exploring, and what Dave is going to be asking us questions about, is why this time things are going to be different. And then we're going to be talking about issues such as jobs or free speech, or what we should do about privacy and freedom. So David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill. We will get into these subjects, and they're, every single one of them, very provocative and contestable. And let me just point out, if you didn't, those of you who haven't been here before, you should have cards at your seats where you can write a question, and we will try to get to those questions before the end of the evening. They'll be gathered up and brought up here in due course. But before we get into the, sorry.
I got to ask you a question. I got to tell you something. I haven't told you this, but in your foreword, you compared us to Heraclitus and Henry Adams. And I read that and I thought, oh my God, I can't possibly live up to that. And I almost went to bed for several days with a bottle of whiskey just to not have to face people after that comparison. But thank you.
It was meant as a compliment.
Oh, I know. It was overwhelming.
Well, Heraclitus is the person who said you cannot step into the river of time twice at the same place. All is change. And Henry Adams, of course, is probably the most famous writer in the American canon who tried to identify the pace of change in the Industrial Revolution as an unprecedented challenge to humanity. But look, before we dive in even more deeply to that kind of philosophical depth, how did you two guys work together? Did you ever argue with each other? Any big disagreements that emerged over the course of this project, or what?
Well,
oh yeah.
Mike and I have worked together before. He edited my first book when he was a struggling writer at the San Jose Mercury. And when he edited the first book, he said, people are going to say it's a fast read. And I had never heard that term before. And suddenly people were coming up to me saying, your book's a fast read. And I thought, this is pretty good. So Mike and I have worked together, and I create some ideas, and he refines them and expresses them beautifully, and then he adds insights of his own. And so it works pretty well up to a point.
Mike, do you agree?
Yes, yes. And then I go a little too far, and I get the note saying, I'm not sure I want to continue with this project, Mike. You're going to ruin all of our reputations. And then he reins me back in.
Well, having read the book, I think your reputations, plural, are secure. So was there a triggering event that got you working on this project, or was it just the accumulation of thought and analysis, or what?
Well, it begins with Bill, absolutely.
Well, it was really interesting. I had been blogging for years about things and had written a number of blogs for The Atlantic. And I was going to say about 20 years ago, I came up with the idea of information equivalence. Information equals what it can replace. And I was thinking about, well, you send an email, or you have a teleconference so you don't have to get on an airplane and go for a ride. And I was playing around with that idea, and I was writing about a number of things. And one day, I went out to lunch with a friend of mine, Brian Arthur, who's a complexity theorist at the Santa Fe Institute. And he said, you ought to read this book by Jim Robertson on phase change in computing. And I read the book, and I thought, what I've been writing about is social phase change. And when that happened, all these pieces sort of fell into place. And I picked up the phone and I called Mike and I said, I think we could write a really interesting article about it. And Mike said, we really ought to write a
book.
Escalation.
That's right.
And so we went to lunch and we started talking and we both agreed. All these descriptions of the fourth industrial revolution just didn't fit with the reality we're looking at. We almost named this book, Why Nothing Seems to Work.
Well, your working title, that I read the manuscript, was Phase Change. Which,
yeah.
Frankly, you take this back to your publisher, I think that's a better title than the one you got, but that's just my opinion.
Well, we kind of agree with you, but but Bill and I sat over lunch and just realized that every explanation we had heard of what's coming wasn't capturing this sort of societal chaos we've been experiencing, where nothing seems to work the same way as it used to, and we don't know what's coming, and we can't extrapolate in the same way we did even 20 years ago with Moore's Law, that the rules themselves were changing, and we couldn't quite decipher what the new rules were.
Let me just turn up the volume on that particular point a little bit, because it is central, I think, to your argument in the entire book, that this is something different. You just explicitly disavowed this as being described as the fourth industrial revolution, or fourth stage of the industrial revolution. So I want to take us back to another famous commentator on this kind of an issue, Franklin Roosevelt, who gave a speech at Milton Academy in Massachusetts in 1926. This is several years before he becomes president or even governor. And I'll just give you the highlights here of what he had to say. He said, a man born 40 or 50 years earlier had been brought up in a Victorian atmosphere of gloomy religion, copybook sentiment, of life by precept, and he had lived essentially as had his fathers before him. But then, Roosevelt said, there came sudden changes. Human voices were carried to him over a tiny copper wire. Juggernauts called trolley cars lined his peaceful roads. Steam was replacing sails. Spluttering arc lights were appearing in the comfortable darkness of his streets. Machine-made goods were forcing out the loving craftsmanship of the centuries. But more dangerous, the accepted social structure was becoming demoralized. Women, think of it, women, exclamation point, were commencing to take positions in offices and industrial places and demanding things called political rights. In politics, too, men were speaking of new ideals and new parties, populist and socialist, were making themselves heard throughout the land. The lives of the great majority of people are more different from the lives of 1875 than were our grandfathers' lives from those at the year 1500. There has occurred an even more rapid condition of change in the past 10 years. So you guys aren't the first people to identify some perception of rapid acceleration of the engines of history. And as you know, because you cited in the book, there are people like Robert Gordon, and a new book just about to come out by Ross Douthat make the case that the great inventions that changed the lives of everybody in this room, and indeed a generation or two ahead of us, were all done between roughly 1870 and 1940.
Right.
and that nothing that's happened since is as comparably transformative. You don't agree with that, so why not?
Well, the reason I would not agree with it is that what we are talking about in the past is material progress. And this is very, very different. I would say this is intellectual progress or immaterial progress. It's a different kind of change. I don't think that our lives are going to improve necessarily that much materially. I mean, we aren't going to get better air conditioning that's going to make us feel a lot more comfortable. I don't think there are tremendous numbers of physical inventions in that sense. The transformation is going to be different, and so it's a intangible. It's infecting the intangibles in our lives, and so I don't know if I've directly addressed your question, but I see in the past it's been about material things. The future is about immaterial things.
Mike?
I say it's a difference between very fast evolution, which is what we've been going through. I mean, I used to comfort myself that my grandmother was born in a cave in the Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s. And on her last trip to see her grandkids, she flew on a 737, and she'd watch men walk on the moon. No generation went through more changes than that. But it wasn't a discontinuity. You can track that trajectory over the course of 80, 90 years. What we seem to be heading into is a fundamental shift. We use fourth industrial revolution, but the real revolution was the industrial revolution. That's when people left the farm, they went into the cities, we created new forms of government, new religions, new underlying political philosophies like Marxism, and so forth. That was a fundamental change. When I was writing this book, the image I kept in my mind was if I was herding goats on the Levant in 3000 BC.
It's hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, and I came over a hill, and there's Jericho, the first city. What would I know about that place? And I would know nothing. I would not even know if human beings lived there. It would be so alien to my experience, the sense of time, the organization of society, what they worshiped, money, cultivation, every single thing about that world would be utterly alien to me. And it's sort of like in the Bible, you know, the Israelites, the ones who wandered in the desert don't get to go across the River Jordan because this is a new world. That was what was happening to these people during the transition from the agricultural world, from the hunter-gatherer world to the agricultural world. And we don't even have much record. We've got Gilgamesh. That's just about it. And it's an allegory. If you look at it closely, it's an allegory for the agricultural revolution, the wild man and the civilized man, and they have to find this balance. And so we don't have a lot of recipes for how to deal with something like this. There's only been two, and they were 3,000, 4,000 years apart. And now even our record, the world of human beings, we can read novels, pastoral novels that took place just before the Industrial Revolution, but they're increasingly alien to us too. We can't quite get into the heads of those people. We can read Dickens, we can read Jane Austen, and look at people in the middle of the transition and capture a little bit of what they were going through, but we don't have a lot of roadmaps. And in the very nature of a discontinuity like a full-blown revolution, all the rules change too. So all the rules we operate in now become obsolete, and we can't predict what the new rules are going to be until we're in the thick of it.
So you make me think, a couple of years ago I flew in a helicopter over Israel and flew over the village of Nazareth. And I was told, and I believe this is to be the case, always welcome contrary evidence, that there is no evidence in the Bible or elsewhere that Jesus Christ ever saw the Mediterranean Sea, which is about 12 or 15 miles away from Nazareth. He saw the Sea of Galilee, but never, so people just didn't see much of the world in those days.
Let's make it local. The Ohlone Indians that lived right here, most of them never got to the bay because there was several tribal families in between who would kill them.
Yeah.
So we have people that were living in present-day Santa Clara, Sunnyvale, and Mountain View that never got to the mountains, never saw the ocean, never got to the bay, traded in between, but their worlds were so isolated. And what brought them together was Mission Santa Clara, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
A disruptor right here.
And that's when they actually became a tribe. They were always just family groups.
But let's go back to this point, because you guys want to make the claim that the autonomous revolution should be understood at a scale comparable to the agricultural and industrial revolutions. So can you just...
All right, so I'd like to give you something that I've been thinking about a lot that really bothers me. However long we know, we have used work as a way of distributing wealth. And that was our wealth distribution system. We are suddenly going into a world where there may not be enough work in the traditional sense to use work as a way of distributing wealth anymore. And there may be lots of people who are doing important things for society who are doing work of absolutely no economic value today. That doesn't mean that it isn't socially valuable, like taking care of somebody old like me or raising a child. Work, I would predict 20 years from now, is probably not going to be nearly as good as a way of distributing wealth, and we're already seeing that today in the income disparity that we're seeing in the, today. And so we're going to have to figure out a different way to distribute wealth in the future. And these are the kinds of challenges that we're going to face as a result of the autonomous revolution. So here we are in a world of abundance. We've got, never has the world had more abundance than we've got right now. If you take a look and divide 116 million families into the gross national product of the United States, it's $73,000 a family. On average, we're very, very wealthy. But the distribution mechanism of the wealth has broken down. So these are the kinds of challenges we're going to face.
There's a story that I actually touch on it in the foreword to the book, so you know it. It goes back to a conversation between Henry Ford II, when he was the chief executive of the Ford Motor Company, and Walter Reuther, when he was the president of the United Auto Workers Union. And the date is a little indeterminate, but let's say it's early 1950s. And so the story goes, Reuther and Ford were standing in the mezzanine looking down over an assembly line floor where the first generation of very primitive robots were at work doing some very simple repetitive task like tightening lug nuts or whatever. And Ford turns to Reuther and he says, "You see those machines down there, Mr. Reuther? Not one of those machines will ever pay dues to your union, and not one of those machines will ever go on strike." And Reuther said, "Well, that may be true, Mr. Ford, but not one of them will ever buy an automobile either." And I love the story. It's maybe apocryphal, but it's too good to let it go. Because it seems to me it sums up, Bill, just what you're talking about. That as a society, at least in the rich societies, and many traditionally poor societies becoming rich very fast, China the big example, we are on the cusp of solving, apparently, the problem of production, but not the problem of distribution. So we can produce all this stuff, but who is going to have the means to actually possess it? Mike?
You know, I think one of Bill's most incisive ideas was the notion that we are at the end of the era of the good job. I mean, we think that it's always been about having a good job, but there was no such thing as the good job in 1720. But by 1760, people wanted lifelong jobs with all the benefits that came with it. Now, in Silicon Valley, having grown up here, we've already seen that's beginning to break apart, that nobody stays in one company to get the gold watch. You know, we're all gypsies running around company after company. But the idea of this defining experience of the industrial age, of having a good job with a pension waiting at the end and all of those things, by necessity is going to disappear. And what replaces it? Because we so much define ourselves by what we do, what our profession is, what our title is.
Well, forgive me, I think maybe a lot of people in this valley and even in this room define themselves that way. But let's not forget that work is the curse of Adam. You shall live by the sweat of your brow. It's a curse, not a benefit. So for some of us, that's not true. But for a lot of people,
True.
A good job means one that pays the bills. That's it.
Yep. But when the good job's being done by that mechanical device sitting next to you and you get to go home, what do you do with your life?
How do I have the means to do anything with my life if it's taken my job?
Exactly. So let's say we live in a world of abundance and we do figure out how to distribute it. What about the content of our lives? If we define ourselves by our job and our hobbies, which are only part of our lives, and other social factors, when most of those go away, where do we find meaning in our lives? What do we do? How do we spend 60 or 70, or thanks to modern medicine, 120 years in a fulfilling way where it used to be you sat on Grandpa's lap and said, what'd you do? And he said, oh, I welded, right rear quarter panels on F-150 trucks for Ford Motor Company for 50 years. I'm a Ford man, and I'm on a Ford pension. Now we say, well, I work for 12 companies. None of them exist anymore, but I got a lot of stock. What do we say in 2080?
Well, there's the question. Bill, do you have the answer?
Well, I was thinking about work being the curse in the Bible, and then you'd know more about this than I, but the Renaissance man was an educated person who lived a life of leisure and hunted quail and lived on his estate and lived a purposeful life, or at least he thought he did. I wonder if we aren't going to find other kinds of purposeful behavior that people will engage in. And if the fact that we have to have a job and go to work 40 hours a week isn't something that sort of has been sold to us, and we've become convinced of it. And that I believe that as a result of this autonomous revolution, we're going to end up with a completely different value system. I think the Protestant work ethic is probably going to go away, and something is going to replace it. And I don't quite know what that is, but these are the kinds of things that cause a lot of conflicts and are the things that result when you go through a phase change.
But there's one fairly specific, concrete policy discussion going on right now that attempts to enter this very conversation and be an answer to what you're talking about. Is universal basic income.
Yes.
UBI. There's serious political voices now saying this is a realistic concept. Do you think that's a viable response to the changes you're talking about?
I don't think we know yet. I like the idea. I like the idea of doing social...
Maybe you should explain what it is first.
Oh, that's where the government provides you with X amount of money every year to live on. Because the understanding is the society's become so efficient, our machines have become so productive that we have all of these benefits. The economy is doing well, but we're not being able to participate in it. So the government says, we're going to give you X amount of money a year and buy stuff, enjoy your life, and because you're never going to be employable. We sort of shocked everybody a couple years ago when we were first starting to think about this book. We wrote a piece for the Harvard Business Review about ZEVs, which are zero economic value citizens. And I just got a note the other day, somebody saying, no, it's NEVs, it's negative economic value citizens, because they'll be consuming, but they won't be producing anything. And it's the idea that machines are getting smarter and smarter, becoming autonomous, they're taking up more and more of the productivity of our economy. And more people are not going to be able to find careers. They're not going to be able to find work. And we used to think, well, that's why you go to high school. Your high school guidance counselor said, study these courses, go to college, so you'll always have a good job. Well, and then a few weeks ago, did you notice Microsoft made that announcement that AI is now more efficient than radiologists. So the professions are starting to get impacted by all of this. Basically, all jobs in some way or another are going to be impacted by this. A growing percentage of the population, might even be eventually be the majority of the population, is not going to be employable, ever.
Yeah.
So what do we do with them? Somebody has to consume. People have to live. And so one solution has been this idea, let's give them a basic annual income. I don't know if it'll work. The real question is the psychological impact of that. We know what welfare, the negative sides of welfare. What happens when 40% of the population is on guaranteed income?
In another era, it was called the dole.
Yeah.
And it was thought to be psychologically demeaning.
Right.
To be on the dole. So if most of the population, or maybe the entire population, gets a basic income, essentially a dole.
Right.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's very hard to predict what the psychological and political, social implications of that would be. Some people think UBI, Universal Basic Income, is a way to address the issue of economic or income inequality. I'm a little skeptical of that. I think inequality will persist even if there is UBI. What do you think about that?
Well, there's going to be inequality, and there's nothing wrong with inequality, and there's nothing wrong with a lot of inequality as long as people have enough. And the problem today is that a lot of people don't have enough. And these are all just very hard issues to deal with, and I think that's why we're calling it a phase change and not just a continuation of the Industrial Revolution. Because if it was a continuation of the Industrial Revolution, we would be able to use work to redistribute wealth. And that just doesn't work anymore. I mean, there are all kinds of perverse ideas that resulted from working on this book. I came across a concept of non-monetizable productivity.
Oh yeah, that's one of the...
And you know, Robert Gordon, in his book on the rise and fall of American growth, pointed out that the economy, the productivity grew at 2.8% a year between 1920 and 1970. But the GNP grew at 3.2% a year. Well, when GNP grows faster than productivity, it creates jobs and people's income goes up. So here I am sitting at Intel in about 1975, and Bob Noyce comes back from a meeting with financial analysts, and he is just so frustrated and angry. Bob was the president of the company and the inventor of the integrated circuit. And I said, "What's wrong, Bob?" He said, "The financial analysts are telling me that our employees are not becoming more productive. The dollar output per employee is not going up. I tell them that we're producing 40% more transistors per employee every year. They're the most productive employees in the world. The problem is that the prices are going down so fast that the dollar output per employee is not growing." Well, we've always said the solution to all our economic problems is increasing productivity. But suddenly in our economy, we're seeing massive amounts of non-monetizable productivity. That is what has happened to the whole media industry. And what really shocked me the other day as I was thinking about this, and here we go, in the semiconductor industry, we were pretty impressed with 40% growth a year. That growth in productivity is a factor of 1,000 over 20 years. That's pretty good. And I suddenly realized that the internet came along and Facebook came along, and we were able to distribute media, and productivity for media distribution probably grew by a factor of 1,000,000 in 10 years. So are dealing with productivity factors that are 1,000 times faster than Moore's law. And these are fundamental things that are going on in society, and I don't think economists have the foggiest idea about how the rules of economics are going to apply anymore to all these things. We're going to have to rethink all of economics coming up.
Mike, you worked at the Mercury News.
Yep.
So you were working there at the time when this great revolution, if I can use the word, happened in the newspaper world over the last couple of decades. What did that feel like?
You know those cartoons where you see the guy running along and the bridge is falling behind him? That's been my career. I mean, I'm a fourth generation newspaper man, okay? I thought I'll go work for the Merc and work my way up to the Times and, follow the usual trajectory. Well, that entire industry died right behind me. I dove out of that, and what I do, became editor of Forbes ASAP magazine during the bubble. Well, that industry died too. My life has been basically running away from explosions as industries disintegrate behind me.
But connect the dots for us. How is your life story a specimen of what the autonomous revolution is doing?
Oh, well, open today's newspaper, look through it, and try to guess which articles were written by human reporters and which ones were written by robots. Some estimates are the average newspaper, especially the business section, the sports section, at least half of it is written by AI. That was my job as a cover reporter, was covering sales and earnings and all of those things.
Oh, hold on.
Machines do that now.
I have trouble imagining this. What's the input to the robot that writes the column?
Oh, they get the raw material from press releases and that sort of stuff. They read it, convert it into the proper form, and it runs in the newspapers. Same with baseball games.
But who does the original input? You said they read something.
Well, at this point, the algorithms are powerful enough. They can read a press release and extract out the key numbers and that sort of thing. Oh. Also, the filings with the SEC, that's even more accurate.
Holy smokes.
The first novels are being written now via AI, and people, they pass the Turing test.
I think I read a lot of those.
Yeah. And they're not very good, but
I read
there's no shortage of bad novels out there by human beings. No, they don't. They've passed the Turing test. They've had people read those novels, and they assume that they've been written by human beings.
Bill,
welcome to my world.
You mentioned banks earlier in your opening remarks as another sector, financial sector, that's being impacted by all this. And my mind goes, when we start talking about that kind of thing, goes to cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Again, connect the dots for us. How are they representative of this general?
Well, so 8 million people work in financial services in the United States today. And it would not surprise me if 4 million people would be working in financial services in the future. And of course, that's a hand-waving guess, but I began to look at things. For example, I looked at the credit card industry. Now, the credit card industry and your debit cards, I think we do about $3 trillion worth of transactions on them a year. And the fees on those transactions, when you get through with the interest and the 2% paid merchants and the transfer fees, are around $200 billion a year, or 6% of the transactions. Now, that seems a little bit extreme to me, especially when I think WeChat in China transferred, I think it was $5 trillion in currencies between people and didn't charge any fees at all. So I could see the whole credit card industry going away, or a lot of it going away. Virtual currencies are really interesting, and I am not a big fan of Bitcoin, but I actually believe that 20 years from now, you're going to see a commodity-based virtual currency. And it's going to be a great currency for a lot of developing countries where their currencies aren't very good, but it probably is going to be better than the American dollar. And the reason is that governments love debtor currencies. Governments love inflation so that they can borrow a dollar from you one time and then pay you back 90 cents on the dollar as a result of inflation. And you, as a holder of dollars, don't like dollars that get inflated, so you'd probably be perfectly happy with a really good virtual currency. And think of this, in many cases, the governments, certainly of developing countries, aren't going to be able to issue their own currencies. And it's entirely possible that the governments of many developed countries, or almost developed countries, might not be in a position to issue their own currencies either. And think of what that would mean to countries like the United States that really enjoy printing money frequently. So these are the kinds of issues that might happen going forward. And I'm not trying to be a futurist in all of this because I don't know what is going to happen. But I can see that there are better technological alternatives that are available. And I somehow have confidence, or I have a lot of confidence, that if there is a better technological alternative, that ultimately people are going to be willing to adopt it.
Mike.
Last weekend, Bill and I wrote the LinkedIn weekend essay, and it was related to this, and that is our economy is beginning to pull itself in two. It's becoming schizophrenic because we have an economy in the natural world which tends to be inflationary, food and the basic necessities of physical life. But we also have now a virtual economy which is deflationary. And they're heading in opposite directions. And we don't know what the we've never had that before. There's never been an alternative economy working simultaneously with the established one, pulling in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I'd like to say that the unfortunate person is the value of his work is being set by robots. So the value of work is going down, being driven by automation, but the value of the necessities of life are being driven by demographics, real estate prices and things like that. And this has become disjointed. Before, in the United States and elsewhere, if the prices went up for food, prices went up for work, and they were very well coordinated. But now things are working in opposite directions.
You want to touch the third rail? Let's do it. We wrote a piece saying free speech has to become expensive.
Yeah, you want to dilate on that one, please?
You want to address that one first?
Okay.
Well, part of the book is a Jeremiah against freeware, by the way.
You begin as a Jeremiah and end kind of Pollyannish, I think. But
yeah.
Right. Well, we want to get to the Pollyannish part. But I was observing that, for about 250 years, we've lived with the myth of free speech in this country. Now, I could say anything to any one of you, but nobody heard me except you. And if I wanted to talk to the masses, large numbers of people, I either had to go through mass media where an editor controlled my speech, or I had to have a lot of money like Mike Bloomberg or the Koch brothers to get my message out to the public. So the free market, the rules of the free market controlled free speech. Suddenly, along comes the internet and Facebook and Twitter, and the cost of one-to-many communication drops by 1 million or 10 million, I don't know what it is. And what we did was we created a mass productivity tool for antisocial behavior. And at that point, free speech really became expensive. So think about this. Junk email. Businesses spend $300 billion a year trying to get rid of it. cybercrime, a lot of it as a result of junk email and phishing expeditions, is another $600 or $700 billion a year. That's $1 trillion in just what I would call externalities. And then you have all the trolls and things like this that are polarizing society. And our answer to this is that we created at Facebook internet police, and they hired thousands of people. Now, those of us who sort of spent a lot of time in the semiconductor industry know that you can't inspect quality into things. You've got to design it in from the first place. And what Facebook is trying to do is inspect quality into a problem. So one of the things I thought about is, well, why not just start taxing email? And suppose you taxed an email a penny or a nickel or what have you, and if you cut down the numbers of emails by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4, you'd have a lot less to police. So what we ought to think about is making some of the things that were free expensive. Mike?
When I looked at it, I was being in the news business, looking at the censors at Facebook. Was it Horace that said, quis custodiet ipsos custodes? You know, who will guard the guardians? Basically, we're being told what we're allowed to look at by a small army of 23-year-olds. You know, and they're bringing their biases in. They're being hired by people with their biases. There's no unseen hand that's working here that keeps everybody honest. You can't, if you censor stuff, how do you get beyond the flaws in your own vision, what you bring to the party? So that model is never going to work. Yeah. It's hard as a reporter. I spent all my time trying to be objective. You had to fight to get past all your prejudices. And it never really worked 100%. So there's got to be some sort of structural mechanism, like making free speech have a monetary value in order to control it that way, to drive away only the most ardent.
So I don't know if there can be such a thing as a second, third rail, but just stay with me for a minute. Let's see if we can go there. At some point in the book, you talk about what are locally known sometimes as the FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and how that's one acronym, but you say they're bad, BAADD. They're big, anti-competitive, addictive, and destructive of democracy. Much of that's quite intuitive, I'd say, until we get to those last two Ds, destructive of democracy. What do you think there is inherent in the autonomous revolution that is destructive of democracy?
Privacy.
You know, I've spent my whole life trying to support entrepreneurship. I mean, this is the home of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is this upwelling of new ideas and innovation into society, into the economy. It creates all the jobs. It keeps society moving forward. The trouble is entrepreneurs have no real voice. You know, they're not like these giant companies paying $20 million to lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to get the legislation that protects them. They're out there sitting in Pete's or in somebody's living room coming up with business models. And the moment they get successful and get big, then they immediately try to put up the walls around their industry. I think that the current climate in the Valley is largely anti-entrepreneurial. You know, I saw too many
anti-entrepreneurial.
Yeah, I saw too many business plans in the last 20 years where the last page is not, then we'll grow and go public. The last page now says, then we'll get bought by Google or Facebook or some giant company. They've developed a very powerful business model where they identify imminent successes and buy them up. You know, that's how Facebook has operated. Jump from Facebook, you know, Instagram, WhatsApp and keep moving forward as they lose their existing audience. That's, I think, a pernicious model.
Well, I think you've answered or explained the anti-competitive A in that acronym, that rather awkward acronym, BAADD. But I'm asking about the threat to democracy, destructive democracy of a political system.
Well, all right. We cannot have a free society if we don't have privacy. And the reason is that if everybody knows everything about you, they will develop very powerful tools to program your mind. And that is what goes on, and that's why we're worried about election interference and things like that. And one of the reasons why I consider that democracy is threatened today is that we have completely lost control over our privacy, and as a result, governments, politicians, businesses are becoming very, very good at manipulating people. And some of the manipulation is for political ends, and some of the manipulation is for commercial ends, and some of the manipulation is being used to polarize society, which we might say is for political ends, but it's got various reasons. And so I think one of the things that has happened as a result of these tremendous amounts of targeting that can take place, because Google and Facebook and others have amassed this massive amount of data, is that it undermines the democratic institutions.
Mike, do you share that view?
Absolutely. A friend of mine, Mike Steep, he runs the Digital Cities Project at Stanford. He, just for a test, he went out and he bought lunch at a restaurant in Palo Alto. And then he went to a drugstore and bought like a pack of gum. And then he got a tank of gas. He had an app that would trace where that data went and where it was shared. And he found out within about 6 weeks it was in 2,000 servers around the world. And by the end of the year, the numbers was in the tens of thousands. So literally every detail of his life was now being shared by the entire world. You're the famous historian. You know that during the revolution, they used two words, right? They used freedom and they used liberty. And we tend to treat them the same way, as if they're synonyms. But freedom is the ability to participate in all the activities of society. You're not kept out by Jim Crow laws and that sort of thing. Liberty, though, is the ability to have command over your own life, to live the way you want to. If we live in a surveillance state, which increasingly we are, your phone is telling servers all over the world exactly where you are within 6 feet. Your car is telling your insurance company how many times you make a fast turn or break the speed limit. We are losing liberty. Yeah. And I think it's critical as we go into this new world that we reassert that liberty, that personal liberty, or we're going to find ourselves controlled.
You know, frankly, I'd take that without disagreeing with you, but take it to a slightly different level. When Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," he didn't mean, in my view, give me personal freedom and the autonomy to do whatever I want. He meant give me a voice in the governance of my community. So it wasn't just personal control, it was the ability to have some kind of a meaningful voice in the way your community was governed, which takes us back to democracy again. I thought, if I can push this point, I don't disagree at all with what you said about privacy, Bill, as an essential element for any orderly society, and democracy in particular. But I thought maybe you were going to go in a different direction, because, given what you said earlier about the media and so on, that credibility or truth, especially in a mass society that has to rely on organs of mass communication for basic factual data about what's going on, is another absolutely essential element for a functioning democracy. So how does the autonomous revolution challenge the existence of credible sources of authoritative, truthful data?
Well, something I have worried about is, I trust people that I can look in the eye, and I have no trust in virtual relationships. And I am sincerely worried that we are going into a society where nobody trusts anybody anymore.
It's true already. It's measurable.
And I worry about that. And I do not know, I worry about how society is going to function if the levels of trust we have go even lower.
Mike?
I want to expand. We talked about liberty. Let's talk about freedom now. There's a phenomena that we call algorithmic prisons. And we're already seeing that emerge in China with this social numbers that you receive by your behavior. And all of us are experiencing these algorithmic prisons. And the pernicious thing is we don't know it. That based on our behavior, we're allowed to do certain things and not others. We don't even know what we're not allowed to do. For example, if we want to buy a house and we want to take out a mortgage, those records sitting out there, those enormous files all about us, can decide what our interest rate's going to be, how much money we can borrow. We're presented with a limited number of options. There's a whole lot more options out there, but we're not going to be shown those. We're only going to be shown the ones we're allowed to see. And I'm struck that given the current trajectory of this surveillance and this lack of privacy, our lives are going to be very circumscribed by these invisible barriers, these walls that are built around us virtually that we don't know are there.
We've got a number, I've just glanced through them, but a number of very interesting and provocative questions here. So if you guys are agreeable, I'm going to toss a couple of them at you.
Sure, but can I say one more thing? Please. By the way, folks, we got about 3/4 of the way through this book, and we were scared to death, and we thought, good Lord, is there anything optimistic in all of this? And we came to the realization that was these great revolutions, these phase changes that occur, they always come out good on the back end. The Industrial Revolution, literacy rates went up, disease went down, life expectancy went up, we traveled more, we were more educated. All these good things happened. The hard part is the transition between the two. And you either do it well or you end up with a lot of blood. But we want to point out the last part of the book, the Pollyanna portion, is utopia. You can see the spires of utopia out there. You just got to get across the valley in between. But the potential world out there with these machines taking over the drudgery of life and everything else is pretty exciting if we can get there. You buy that? You agree with me?
No, hey, we've done it twice before, and we know there are problems and there are challenges. And I think the whole book is an argument for the fact that you've got to look at problems differently. And if you say, hey, the only way we're going to distribute wealth is through the job, and because that's the way we've been distributing wealth for the past 200 years, you're going to have a problem in the future. So we're going to have to be willing to be more open-minded about these things, but we will find solutions to the problems.
So one question from the audience reads as follows. This makes me think of something that we've touched on in conversation. Did the people who lived during the prior revolutions fear the future? Were they glad they would not have to experience the future? That is, would they be dead before things got really bad? Now, the question...
Well, just ask the Luddites.
Well, the question prompts me to reflect on something that we've discussed a little bit. is the nature of science fiction as a literary genre is almost universally dystopian. Almost all visions of the future that we get out of science fiction, beginning with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right, in some ways the original science fiction work, portray a future that is to be feared. So do you share that view? You have a science fiction writer's view of the future? Your book certainly begins that way.
I don't. I have enormous trust in mankind. We muddle through. I mean, the genetic record suggests that at one point all of humanity came down just a handful of families huddled on the North African shore of the Mediterranean, and we clawed our way all the way back to becoming a dominant species on Earth. We get through. It's not easy, and it's oftentimes horrible and painful. But human beings, we're the innovators, we're the creators. And the more open-minded we become and the more we deal with these problems and adapt to them, the better off we're going to be.
Well, with all respect, you know whatever follows that introductory statement is going to be an argument.
Yeah.
I think that's an act of faith. And as a person of faith, I'm with you, but it is an act of faith, it seems to me. And it actually connects with this next question, if you'll allow me. It says, what new or current metrics do you see becoming prevalent to describe the economy, we might dilate that to the world at large or society at large, as a result of the autonomous revolution? If we're going to measure what's happening, what are the kinds of metrics you think we should use?
Well, there are people who are using different metrics. You know, we have used GDP as the metric for happiness, and there are other societies that are coming up with, you know, indices that measure health and you know, the level of pollution and things like this. And you know, the nice thing about measuring GDP is it's really easy, and there is, you know, you can sort of, it's harder to argue with it. And now you get all these mushy things, but I think we're going to have to come up with a different way of measuring quality of life. And the quality of life is going to be health and you know, the amount of pollution we're exposed to and things like this.
But how do you measure things like satisfaction or happiness?
Well, I think maybe you measure suicide rates.
Yeah, I think there's been attempts. 20 years ago, there was a movement to audit intangible assets, intellectual capital, and they came up with a whole set of metrics and everything else. It's been kind of operating behind the scenes, but I could see stock markets beginning to incorporate those intangibles in into their valuations of companies. I can also see non-monetizable productivity being measured and incorporated into the valuation of operations.
Well, there are efforts now to measure happiness in various societies, and
right.
American society, as it happens, doesn't come off terribly well.
Well, one of the things that impelled us to write this book was the sense that not only things weren't working, but life expectancies in the United States among men had gone down for the first time in our history. Yeah. I mean, that's a measure of a deep unhappiness with the way things are. We now talk about
deaths of despair being increasingly common in our society. So here's another. If virtual worlds and work and autonomous vehicles included are to become a reality, do you think there will be a reverse migration of people from cities to rural regions, which is the opposite of what the Industrial Revolution accomplished? Now, the data point in the different direction, at least as of right now, that we're concentrating ever more in big metropolitan areas. And I've seen the recent number, it's something like within a decade or two from now, something like 75% of Americans will live in 15 states.
No. So I have lots of good news. Every time we have gone through one of these phase changes, we've really redone the physical infrastructure of society. And it's hard to predict what it's going to look like, but you know, we created the industrial city, and then when we created the suburbs and things like this. And I believe that the autonomous society or revolution is going to come with a very different physical infrastructure. And I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I suspect that the automobile is going to become obsolete, that we're going to rely more on public transportation. I suspect that it will be more urbanized, but that we'll build our cities more as living cities in the sort of the mold that Jane Jacobs in her books of the 1960s predicted, with more parks and walking space. I think we're going to repurpose a lot of shopping space and office space. Today, we spend about 5% of our GDP on construction. During the Eisenhower administration, we spent around 10. And so that I think the job creation engine of the future might be construction, where we rebuild the infrastructure of our society. Now, on top of that, we've got a lot of sewers to fix and bridges to repair and things like that. So we've got a lot of work to do. So that may be where we're all working.
Mike?
Now, here I disagree a little bit. I'm torn. People may want to move to the cities because of the loneliness, the anonymity we have of living on the web and living in virtual space. We want to be near other human beings. We want to swap pheromones. We want to talk to people in real life. On the other hand, remember Ada Huxtable wrote about the power of cities was random juxtaposition, where you have all these different stores and shops and experiences right next to each other, and that's what made cities interesting. Well, virtual space gives us that experience. So I think there's opposing forces at work here. But one thing for certain, it will transform the city utterly.
Here's a kind of a political question, at least it has a political component, about China. So the Chinese are, we think, investing way more than we are in the development of AI. So should we be concerned about that, or is it by its very nature, will that be a shared technology that will benefit everybody, or is proprietary control over it going to be a really important political geostrategic property?
I think attitudes toward China are changing in real time right now. I think the image of them as an unstoppable juggernaut, you know, the new Silk Road and racing forward with AI and all that has run into the reality of the coronavirus and the fact that we can't trust their numbers. We don't know where the source was. There's a lot of things about that society are being exposed right now. And I don't want to guess what the long-term impact is, but I think China's place in the world is going to emerge very different after all of this.
Bill, do you have a Chinese?
Well, yeah, I worry about AI, and I worry about the broader anti-science attitude that is growing in the United States. And people are really angry at science and technology now, and I sometimes say to them, then why are you taking antibiotics? We forget, we like to look at things and say, well, AI is bad, but the automobile is good. And the technologies that we're familiar with and using we love. But I believe we are underinvesting in technologies and science today, and it's the thing that has enabled us to be the most prosperous economy in the world. And I worry about the Chinese becoming ultra competitive in all these areas and us underinvesting in them.
But other innovative and disruptive technologies soon spread or imitated or replicated in different ways, and they became the property of mankind at large, not just one community's monopolistic possession. So why wouldn't AI fit in that category?
I mean, why wouldn't they share everything that they did?
Well, they don't necessarily have to share it. It can be reverse engineered and replicated in other ways. I mean, railroads were not confined to Britain in the 18th or 19th century. They spread all over the world.
Yeah, but we had to steal loom technology.
That's one example, yeah.
Yeah,
We did.
and I know for a fact companies now in the US and India and elsewhere, when they show their new products in China, before they do, they build in tripwires to wreck that device if it tries to be reverse engineered.
Well,
and because the fear is the Chinese will take it, throw enormous amounts of capital at it, exploit it, and then use it to take over a market.
All right, here's another macro level question. AI is energy intensive. If you've ever visited those big server farms up in the Columbia Gorge, you know what we're talking about. AI is energy intensive. Given the climate crisis, how will it prevail?
I was going to answer, our brains are pretty energy intensive too.
Well, the next question is going to be about the brain, so we'll get there. Hold on.
I don't know how to answer that question. It is energy intensive, and for sure.
But it's thousands of times more efficient than a steam engine. I mean, what we've done is we've made things infinitely more efficient, but then we've scaled it up infinite number of times. So, you know, the modern personal computer uses very little wattage compared to a mainframe that is more powerful than, but we have 20 billion personal computers out there.
Yeah. Well, it might interest you. I was just a few months ago in Xinjiang, the far western province in China, and one day driving across the desert, we drove through a wind farm that was 35 miles long and 4 to 6 miles deep either side of the road. So China is finding other sources of energy to fuel this kind of thing. All right, let's go back to the biological level. Somebody asked, what are your thoughts on brain-computer interface as a means to enhance human capabilities to level the playing field? How about biohacking and gene editing? So you guys have opened all kinds of Pandora's boxes here.
Well, I was thinking about that, but you know, we have a very excellent brain-computer interface today. We always think about it having to be wires running into our brain. But, you know, with the Internet of Things, I'm measuring your emotions. I'm using your brain chemistry, dopamine to program your behavior. I'm learning how to better manage your oxytocin, to make friends with you. You don't need to put wires into people's brains to control them. Eyes and ears work pretty well. And I have come to the conclusion that we've got billions of cyborgs out in society who don't realize they're cyborgs today.
Right. Watch your kid playing a video game.
They're being programmed.
Yeah, we just wrote a piece about, we're worried about robots taking over our lives, but we're voluntarily becoming robots for large portions of our day. And that the idea that we plug computers into us, in fact, we're beginning to plug ourselves more and more into our computers.
At some point early on in your book, you say something to the effect that things, robots or whatever, will be the repositories of memory, and you seem to be speculating that the human facility for memory is going to atrophy. Do you really believe that?
Well, I don't remember that speculation.
Well, you know, the guy who built this museum when it was in Boston and brought it out here, what has he done the last few years? He has completely loaded himself with recording equipment, recording every second of his life.
So, Bill, so that I wouldn't forget, I flagged it. So here's what you wrote. So the real repositories of practical knowledge will shift to autonomous devices, which will learn much more quickly than people can. In situation after situation, automatons will substitute for humans, even in the category of remembering things, you seem to be saying. Right. You remember now?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember Mike wrote that sentence.
Oh, blame me. Nice, blame me for that one.
Okay. All right. If you were granted 2 minutes in front of Congress to recommend how to prepare better than we're currently doing, is the implication, for the autonomous revolution, what would you say? You each get 1 minute.
Whew. Well,
40 seconds left.
You know, I would tell them to, really realize that you're going to have to rethink the forms and the rules of everything, and to just stop saying, this is the way we did it before, and we're just going to apply that to the future. So I'm going back to this, what we said earlier, the forms are going to change and you better act differently. And now I realize that's not very specific.
So let's say I'm the senator from Minnesota.
Yes.
And I say, thank you for that, Mr. Davidow, but can you be more specific?
Well, we'd have to be talking about a specific situation. But I know what I want to do about privacy, and I would tell you what I wanted to do about privacy. I've already told you what I wanted to do about free speech. I want to charge for it.
Mike?
Oh, it'd be simple. I'd say we have to restore the ownership of information to the people who create that information. They have to be able to decide who uses it. They have to be rewarded for selling that information. They have to be able to opt out of it being taken from them. That human autonomy now, there's a penumbra around us of information. It's not just no longer our physical bodies or our thoughts. It's all this wake of data we leave behind us. We have to be in charge of that. That is ours, and we have to restore that ownership to each of us.
So the last question I'm going to ask you comes from none other than Ed Feigenbaum, and actually, I think intersects nicely with the way you end your book, not the way you begin it, where you talk about all the malevolent things that the autonomous revolution is going to bring with it. But Ed's question is this: the pictures you are painting are quite dystopian. Yes. Can you paint for us the utopian side of the autonomous revolution?
Well, the utopian side is that we are living in a world of abundance. And if we can't figure out how to deal with the problem in that environment, I mean, it's hard for me to believe. It's one thing if there's scarcity and half the world is starving, and half the world is standing outside freezing to death, but we've got plenty of stuff. And so we ought to be able to solve the problem. And so that's the utopian view.
Mike?
Human history has been defined by scarcity. Famines, nations have attacked each other to take their stuff, and back and forth. Everything we've built, all the institutions and everything else, are based upon the idea of overcoming scarcity. We are right on the brink of an era where there's abundance, and there's abundance for everybody. And the drudgery of life to escape scarcity, of working and building stuff, it's going to be done increasingly by intelligent machines. So the good news is, if we can figure out these new rules and put them into place, so much is going to be delivered to us. The burdens of the past, the backbreaking work, the disease, the poverty, all those things have the potential to go away. We just have to get to that point. But those things are all possible now, unlike any time before in human history.
All right. So it's a part of the Computer History Museum's tradition here to do something called the one-word initiative. So you were forewarned about this. You were asked to write down one word of advice for a young person starting out in his or her career. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you to go first. Then, Bill, can you share your one word of advice and the story behind why you chose this word?
Take it from a guy who, like I said, whose career is blown up 4 times already. If the autonomous revolution is real, everything changes, all the rules changes. Everything you know, every expertise you have is about to become obsolete. You have got to continuously change and adapt to this new world.
Bill?
So I wrote Independent. When I was growing up, we could depend on so many things. People that I knew were going to work for companies, and they thought they were going to work for them for 20 years. And change wasn't as fast, and so you could sort of think that you were going to learn one thing, and it would be your profession forever. Today, we have to take increasing responsibility for ourselves. We better be able to prepare to constantly re-educate ourselves. We've got to think about, hey, I'm going to have to save for my retirement because Social Security might not be that great. We have to be entrepreneurs as individuals and take care of ourselves and be much more aggressive about acting independently and looking after ourselves. Well, I was asked to supply one word as well, and it probably shouldn't surprise anyone here. It's history, and it's not only because I've made my living at it for half a century, but because I think everything has it, including technology and including the background of this society. And I do believe if we don't know where we've come from, we know neither where we are or where we might be headed. So that's my one word. And
Thanks, everyone.